Good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. As a good reminder, if you do have your cell phone, please silence your cell phone. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Rachel Lamb. She is our Carhart lecturer this year. The Carhart is actually part of a wider series on campus, Dakota Wesleyan Speaker Series. So we are very excited that we've been able to continue this series this year and continue it in person and have people in the crowd. Dr. Lamb, she originates from Grand Rapids, Michigan, so she is a Midwest girl at heart. From there, she traveled to Chicago to Wheaton University to work on her undergrad. From Wheaton, then she headed out to Maryland. And in Maryland, she completed her master's and her Ph.D., and you'll talk a little bit about that here and the work that you are doing now. So if we could please give a hand to Dr. Lamb.
Well, good evening. Hopefully everyone can hear me in the back. I hear my microphone on, so that's great. Thank you again for the invitation to talk with you a little bit more about both earlier today, where I kind of talked about the Christian faith with what I study and sort of how I came to care about this big topic of climate change, but also share with you a little bit this evening about some of the research that I've done in this topic area. So I invite you tonight to put your science hats on with me. Some of you already are scientists, so that's great. Maybe this is maybe a different topic than you're used to studying. Some of you might not be scientists, and so we're going to think about this beautiful role that nature plays, or that our environment plays, in helping us think through a range of societal challenges, including climate change. So some of this work stems from research that I did at the University of Maryland. Some of it comes from the work that I did as a Maryland Sea Grant Science Policy Fellow, and some of it is actually some current work that I do with the Maryland Department of the Environment. So you get it all together in one shot here. So tonight we're going to work through this outline together, where we're just going to start with providing some context and some definitions for the work. What are we talking about, and make sure we're on the same page. Then I'm going to share some of the really cool science and technological advancements that really helped improve our understanding of the role of nature in this giant carbon climate context, and then talk a little bit about how that improved understanding of the science is actually applied, or makes itself known for improvements in land management and land protection. And then talk a little bit more about where I see the science going on this topic and some opportunities for future applications. All right, so first of all, what we're talking about today is the role of nature in addressing a number of, as I mentioned, societal challenges. So sometimes in a global context, you'll hear the term nature-based solutions, or NBS. Simply, these are approaches that really look at nature and work with and enhance it, both in a terrestrial context and in a marine context, and doing it in such a way that it provides direct benefits for both people and biodiversity. So in the image on the right-hand side, you see all of these different traditional ecosystem-based approaches, like land protection and restoration, or issue-specific, maybe focuses on specific types of ecosystem challenges in a local context, and also management on behalf of some goal, like management of resources to meet a particular need. And when we think about all these different ecosystem-based approaches, they're really helping us ultimately think about how it addresses food security, water security, social and economic development, disaster risk, health. Nature provides all of these different resources for us, and so these are broadly termed nature-based solutions. Specifically, what we are talking about today is a subset of those solutions. So sometimes they're called nature-based climate solutions, or nature-based solutions to climate change. And one really cool thing about nature is that it can help us avoid additional greenhouse gas emissions, one of the drivers, or human drivers, of the change that we're experiencing. And it can do so by taking a lot of that carbon from the atmosphere and storing it within the land, in the soils, and in the living biomass. And then it can also not only help with mitigating or reducing the impacts or the drivers of this change, but it also can help us build resilience and help us with adaptation. So it both can be a solution for addressing some of the drivers and then also helping us maintain resilience in the face of ongoing change. There are 3 types of nature-based climate solutions. You can kind of see in the infographic here. We typically talk about trees or forests. We talk about agricultural land, both pasture, grazing land, cropland. And then we also talk about tidal wetlands or coastal tidal wetlands. Now, of course, when we talk about natural climate solutions, it's important to recognize they're one tool in a wide range of tools that we have. So at the top, we see that in order to address some of the global challenges we're facing from climate change, it really means we need to attract some of the primary drivers, which include things like where we get our energy from, how we think about transportation, a lot of how we think about industry, and again, the sources of fuel that we're using. But nature does play an important role. It's a subset of the options that we have. And again, if we're looking across different types of ecosystems, we can see that forests are an important role. We can see again that wetlands and grasslands also play an important role. And then also when we think about farmland or grazing lands. So if we think about nature, we can subset it into 3 types of approaches. There's a protection approach, there's a management approach, and a restoration approach. So protection provides a lot of important benefits. And if you see the kind of slice of the protect pie, the darkest blue color is the largest portion of that wedge. And that's looking at the carbon benefits that our protected forests provide. So trees, and I'll talk about this in a moment, they store an incredible amount of carbon in their roots, their stems, their leaves, their soil. So just by virtue of protecting the existing forest that we have, it does tremendous benefit in terms of making sure that any carbon that it's taking from the atmosphere and storing remains protected and stored. The second subset of opportunity around protection is particularly around wetlands. So wetlands actually per square acre store far more carbon than any other natural system. So especially tidal coastal wetlands. So they're an incredible reservoir or sink of carbon. So by protecting them, again, we make sure that that carbon stays protected and it is not re-released into the atmosphere. Grasslands are a smaller portion of that opportunity, but you see it as a small light blue sliver on the side. All right, so in addition to protecting and maintaining all of this, all the benefits of these systems, we can also think about improved management. So one big slice of that pie there is on forestry practices. A second, much larger opportunity is around farmland management, and then a third one, which again is a much smaller wedge, is also grazing land. The third category is around restoration. So this is about thinking about afforestation or reforestation around trees, so restoring those forests, particularly in areas where maybe there's been a long land use where they haven't been before, or potentially in new places where it makes sense to plant them, creating new area and new opportunity. And then also restoring wetlands. So when I use the term natural climate solutions and I'm talking about natural carbon sinks, these are the types or range of activities and approaches that we're considering when we think about how we go about measuring and monitoring these benefits across space and over time. So I'm going to break down one example for us in an area that I've spent a lot of time in, and that's around forests and trees. All right, so forests store carbon, as I mentioned, in a whole lot of different pools. So you can see on the image on the left-hand side, trees store carbon in their trunks and in their leaves and their branches. That's everything above the soil. Sometimes we call it above ground biomass. They also, of course, are storing a lot of carbon in their roots, in the soil systems where they reside, and in a healthy functioning forest, you're also going to have it in the litter, like when you have a branch or leaves falling down that are deteriorating in the soil, and also when a tree falls down and you have dead standing biomass. So what we're trying to do is evaluate or quantify how much carbon is being stored in all of these pools. And then as we watch this natural system move throughout succession over time, we're tracking it through its forest carbon cycle, which is on the right-hand side. So this is an image, again, by the U.S. Forest Service, who again is really interested in tracking and improving management of these carbon pools. And you can see that as trees are growing, they're taking a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, right? They're storing it in all of those different carbon pools. They're growing it, and as they grow, it's at an increasing rate at which they're sequestering or removing that carbon. And then, of course, some carbon gets re-released, right? If there's a forest fire, for example, some of it gets released when there's decay and a tree, falls down. Some of it's going into the soil, some of it's re-released. And then the soil basically supports ongoing maturation of new trees. And you see succession occur again, where now trees are increasing uptake and storage again. So the more we understand about this cycle and more ways to influence the cycle to expand capacity for those forests to store more carbon, that's going to make a difference in our fight on climate change. Because what we need to do is be able to take more greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide, and we can use our natural and working lands to do that, because that's the way that they're naturally designed to work. So 3 different ways of thinking about this is related to the previous slide. Is we can think about protecting our current forests. So that means where trees and forests exist now, we protect that existing area, and we want to make sure we're protecting them to avoid loss. So if we have large conversion of forest land to other land uses, then potentially that means that we have a re-release of that carbon back into the atmosphere. We could also think about managing our current forests. So again, thinking about the existing footprint, the existing area, where we can create larger sinks or larger opportunities for more storage. And there's a lot of really interesting ideas about how to improve that management to do that. And then third, we can think about, again, identifying new potential areas for reforestation and afforestation. And of course, that one can be sometimes challenging, right? Because if you're creating new areas for trees, it might mean the conversion or change of an existing land use. So this has a carbon opportunity in that it creates a new sink, right? A new opportunity for new storage. But we have to acknowledge that there's going to be some land use trade-offs in doing that, right? Because it had some use before. So if we're understanding the potential role of natural climate solutions, like the role of forest in storing carbon, one of the real questions is, how do we know how much carbon is being stored in the landscape? How do we begin to quantify it? Because if we can quantify it and measure it and monitor it, that might help us think about different management options or incentives that are tied to the specific thing that we are valuing or trying to quantify, meaning carbon here. So one of the really amazing scientific advancements here is in geospatial tools. So I worked with NASA and NASA's carbon monitoring system, which tries to bring together new approaches in remote sensing. So remote sensing technologies utilize satellites or aircraft to basically take an assessment of the landscape, and they're using a whole bunch of different techniques. One, which is called LIDAR, or light detection and ranging, is like a radar and basically can send a pulse from a satellite or an aircraft down to Earth and measure the distance. So it measures the distance to hitting a tree canopy or hitting the ground, and it can basically create this really cool 3D profile, like you see in the top left-hand corner, of the forest. So what's really important is for understanding how much carbon is being stored there, is that if you have a metric of height, so you know roughly how tall the trees are and you roughly know what species they might be, then you can actually relate height metrics and you can relate different species characteristics to the amount of biomass that they're storing. And about half of all biomass is carbon. So by taking advantage of these really cool remote sensing techniques, we can basically map the world's forests in 3D, understand their height and biomass characteristics, and also understand using a variety of different imagery techniques, like shown on the bottom left-hand side, where those trees are occurring. So how high they are, what their species type is, and map where tree canopy is. We can use that in the context of ecosystem modeling to understand how much carbon they're storing, and we can validate that based on field data. So a very traditional approach to doing this would be if you were trained as a forester and you went out and you actually sampled a part of your forest and you went around and you measured trees. You measured roughly how wide they were, what their diameter was, roughly how tall they were. You take some metrics about what kind of species they were, the environmental conditions, and you could make an assessment of how much biomass or how much carbon was being stored there. So now we have this ability to take all of this existing field data and look at that, those same locations where the field data was taken with what our model says is there based on remote sensing, and we actually find amazing agreement. So now instead of doing all this very intensive labor in the field, we can actually use these really cool remote sensing and modeling techniques to estimate it at wide spatial scales. So actually what you can see a map here at the top right hand corner is we basically have a map of the entire forest or treed area in the state, and we know exactly how much carbon is being stored there, or as best as we can estimate from our modeling, we know that at very high spatial resolution. So we can look in someone's backyard, for example, or at 90 square meters, and know how many trees are there, how much carbon is being stored, and that's an unprecedented capability. This is really important for thinking about how we measure and monitor change over time, because people want to feel that they have some level of certainty about that. If you're going to start measuring it and monitoring it and paying people for outcomes, you want to make sure that you have a more reliable way of tracking that information. So not only can you use it to map where current trees are and how much carbon they're storing, but you can, again, use it in the context of modeling to project how much more carbon you could get if those trees continued to grow. So here's an example from Maryland, again, at high spatial resolution, and as what you see over time is if those existing trees continued to grow and you planted new trees, maybe anywhere that it was ecologically appropriate to do it, you can basically watch the greening of the state, and you can equivalent the amount of space and the unique, environmental conditions that are allowing those trees to grow to the amount of carbon that could be stored. What's interesting in the state of Maryland is that its potential, its remaining potential to store carbon is twice as much as it currently stores now. This is not policy prescriptive, because there might be a lot of places we don't want to grow trees just because they could be there. But what it does do is at least give you a quantifiable or a science-based understanding of what could be there. So if you start to make land use decisions, carbon can at least be a part of the conversation. Prior to that, you wouldn't have enough quantifiable information to even make an assessment about those benefits. So we can map that biomass and carbon across space. We can see how much more could be there as those systems continue to grow. What we also can do is measure and monitor in real time what's happening across the landscape. So another term I want to introduce to you is the idea of a carbon flux. So when we look at the stocks or the pools, that's how much is being actively stored. But as I mentioned, as trees grow, right, as they continue to remove or sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it as carbon in their biomass, the rate at which they do that every year is called a flux. So we can look across the entire landscape and in every year take a snapshot of how much carbon there's being actively stored, that's being gained. We can look at how much is being lost due to maybe land use change or removals or perhaps other kinds of disturbance like an insect outbreak. And then we can also identify new spots across the landscape where there might be new growth or regrowth. And that could be because we planted trees there or because the forest is just doing its thing. It's going through natural regeneration. So this flux term is a combination of all three of those things happening across the landscape. So what we want to do is use, again, our really cool remote sensing technologies to identify where this is happening across space and use our model of our ecosystem, again, what we think the age of those trees are, how much biomass we're storing, to connect what's happening on the landscape with the carbon impact from that change. So a gains is any ongoing growth where there is existing forest, right? We mapped where those trees were. We're allowing them to keep growing like I showed you in the model, and so we can take a snapshot at any given year about the gains happening and how much carbon. We can also look at losses. So we are pretty good at detecting when there's a loss of tree canopy cover, and they use different reflectance techniques to see greenness and change in greenness from year to year and identify where they see losses. And then we also see regrowth, right, where we see new trees or new biomass being accumulated and we see new expanded cover. So sometimes you might need a mapped image to understand this kind of a equation here, this qualitative equation, where in time 1 you have maybe a forest area, right? In T1 it's all dark green. And then in time 2, a lot of that forest area remains intact, it's still dark green, but maybe you see losses being detected, like in the kind of orange-red sea. And then you also see new areas or new pixels with regrowth, which is the light green. And inside the model, what we're doing is showing, again, the above-ground biomass or the carbon impacts of all of those changes across the landscape. One way that this looks over time is like the following graphic, and I'll play it a couple times, but this is what it looks like, actually, on our annual maps across space. So on the picture over on the left-hand side, you see, we call it a disturbance data set, and what remote sensing is doing is it's picking up in all of those red areas where there's been a loss of tree canopy cover. So it doesn't know how much carbon is there, it doesn't know any information other than it sees that it once was trees and now it's not. What we can do then is identifying where those areas are, look inside the model and say, okay, how much biomass was there? We can see in the middle panel the flux. In that year, how much was gained or lost. And as a result, on the right-hand side, you can see a change in the carbon stock across the entire landscape. So this is a really interesting way of getting at real-time changes in tree canopy cover. And this is showing you, again, another example from Maryland, but it actually, this remote sensing technique is really something that they're employing globally as something called the Global Forest Watch system. And it's actually been really interesting and helpful for detecting in real-time changes, for example, to tropical rainforest deforestation. They can actually detect it at, I think they're within a couple days. They use it's a satellite called Landsat, and they can detect those changes in real time, and that can inform policy or management intervention when they detect it. What's really cool here is that we're now quantifying the carbon benefit or change associated with that change in landscape, which is going to help us when we think about interesting management questions from a carbon climate point of view. So what we show here then is a very systematic science approach, where we're using these new NASA technologies to map and establish existing baseline. Where are trees now? We're modeling to facilitate planning. Where might they go in the future, and how much carbon are we going to get if we allow current trees to continue growing or we plant or expand tree cover in other places? And then we have an approach that facilitates annual monitoring, where we can track these changes at annual time steps and evaluate how well we're doing relative to maybe some of the policy goals that often get set at a county or a statewide scale around tree canopy cover and maybe even carbon goals related to it. So this is all really interesting science, and the fact that we're using remote sensing and modeling, but we really have to think about how it's going to be leveraged towards strategic management. So one way to think about it is, how does this actually get worked out in planning? How does this get worked out in existing policy tools? And how could you combine it with economic information or consideration of other benefits, co-benefits that trees provide to really be more strategic about your policies and planning? And of course, part of this is in support of climate goals and the fact that we've got to find ways to mitigate impact by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide, for example, in the atmosphere, but recognizing that has a lot of other practical benefits for us because we rely upon the land directly to meet all sorts of human livelihood and well-being metrics. So I'm going to give you two examples from the state of Maryland. One is we have a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act plan. And in that plan, we identify really specific targets in the number of acres per year or the number of trees per year that we want to protect or restore or improve management. And in order to evaluate the impact of that towards our climate goals, we have to be able to quantify it. So this new science that I was just talking about is actively being used by the state to have a better assessment of the degree of impact. There's a lot of different climate solutions out there, and we can't just rely upon natural climate solutions, but by being able to quantify it, we can actually compare it to other strategies and understand how much we can grow the size of that natural carbon sink. So we're doing that actively in terms of forest in particular, and then we have to be able to measure and monitor progress against our goals. So if we say we're going to reduce our emissions 40% by 2030, how do we know if we're on track to do that? So the tool for doing that is a greenhouse gas inventory. So I introduce you to the concept of a flux. So this is what it's doing. It's saying what happened in any given year. How well are we doing towards our goals? What's an assessment of that? And we're actually using that monitoring strategy that I showed you to calculate how much our forests are contributing in any given year. What's really cool about it is that you can understand the attribution. So you might see that the number goes up and down between 2006 and 2020. There's a lot of variability happening there. So one question I would want to know is why? Is it as simple as tree covers expanding or contracting? And the short answer is no, it's not actually that simple. Some of it is due to favorable weather conditions. If you have favorable weather conditions in some year, maybe your trees are growing a whole lot. If you don't have as favorable of conditions, maybe their growth is slowed, or maybe you have some kind of disease outbreak or fire or some other disturbance that's impacting that rate. So what we can do is break apart those causes or those attributions, and that helps us be really specific about how to improve management, or be more specific at how we can actually continue to grow the size of these sinks given what's happening in the background. And this is actually a brand new capability that we worked on in the last year or two that a lot of states are really interested in adopting, so they can be more precise in how they intervene within the system. The third thing I mentioned was combining it with economics. So that's really great that we can quantify carbon, and it's really great that we can do that relative to, let's say, some climate goals that we have and track progress. But it's really hard when you think about management and restoration of land, because somebody owns that land. It doesn't just exist. Somebody owns it, they manage it, there's got to be goals for it. And thinking about how to manage your land in a way that is climate friendly sometimes has inherent benefits, economic benefits in other ways, like maybe it improves soil health, or maybe improved forest management actually opens up additional economic opportunities in the commodity market. But sometimes we can think about actually renting or paying for the carbon benefit itself. So I led an analysis in Maryland where we kind of asked if we set up an economic system where we rented landowners for the carbon they were storing on their landscape, and we compared it to the amount of, let's say, your annual revenue that they would get from existing land uses, when would it actually make more economic sense for them to grow trees than maintain their existing land use? And what you can see is if you compare those economic opportunities at any given year, so again, your trees are storing carbon more and more. Every year, you're growing the size of the carbon sink I can rent from you. You can see that at certain years, in many cases, it might be immediate. You might actually immediately get benefit just because I'm renting the existing trees that you have on your property while you're continuing to grow new ones. There's incredible benefit immediately, but even if we look across decades, there's actually a considerable amount of the land area that becomes more profitable for you to grow trees if I'm renting the carbon for you. We looked at this across a range of carbon prices and rental rates, and we compared it, in this case, with ag lands, not, again, because we're trying to be policy prescriptive, but we were curious if there was marginal cropland where you as a farmer were not actually gaining a huge profit margin. If you decided to put your marginal cropland to grow trees and we paid you for the carbon, when would you come out ahead? So we compared this in these matrices where we looked at different carbon rental rates, and we asked how much would it cost to do that, and we also evaluated across these different scenarios how much carbon we would get for the benefit. And we actually saw that if you paid, let's say, $20 per ton of carbon and rented your value of that stock at 5%, it would cost about $5.8 million per year to do that on all outcompeted cropland in the state. So that was at least a quarter of all the cropland in the state would be immediately more profitable if we rented the carbon from you at that rate. And we could see that we could get, by 2030, about 6.9 million metric tons of carbon, which was actually a significant portion of the carbon that the state needed to reach its carbon mitigation goals. So you might say, well, that seems like a lot of money. Where is that coming from? That's a very small fraction of the amounts of subsidies that many of the farmers that are receiving for still very low profit margins, at least in the context of our state. And it's actually even smaller portion of the revenue that we generate from participating in a regional market that we're required to, by law, reinvest in climate-friendly strategies. So there's actually money out there in a pool that we can reallocate to strategic opportunities. And one of the things we wanted to suggest is that we don't want to replace agriculture, particularly in our prime ag land, but there could be opportunities where if we value the carbon that's being stored across the landscape, and trees might be a benefit for multiple reasons, we could pay landowners more money than they're making now to do it. And so this actually, we're actually working to establish some kind of policy direction that could actually include a carbon rental model into the incentive programs for certain best management practices that relate to tree planting. And I'm going to come to in a second maybe some opportunities for how we could expand this analysis. And one thing is that we know, as I mentioned before, that actually cropland management or agricultural management is a natural carbon solution in and of itself, that it does sequester and store carbon. So it's not as simple as we're just trying to convert marginal cropland to trees because trees are the only thing that is a climate-friendly practice. No, actually in some cases, maybe it's better off staying in agricultural production and still generating quite a bit of carbon storing benefits. So one of the things we're doing to that extent is broadening the scope. So not only are we looking at trees and reforestation, but we're really looking at ag land, and we're also looking at coastal tidal wetlands. So what we're trying to do is take everything that we've been learning from a science and accounting point of view and thinking about how it makes sense in these other systems. And we really want to maximize landowner engagement by focusing on livelihood benefits. I mean, that's working the land and stewarding the land provides a lot of resources for people, right? It's how we meet our food security needs. It's how we think about stewardship for a range of other benefits. In Maryland, it's water quality benefits. When people are working and stewarding the land, it helps us maintain a healthier Chesapeake Bay. So we already know that landowners are already doing this, so we want to think about what additional benefits we can provide landowners when we start quantifying the carbon impacts. And we're trying to utilize the best available science to do that, to reduce uncertainty and reduce risk. Because we know that there could be a lot of risk if you start paying for carbon if you're not quite sure that it's real or that it's actually being stored in a way that we can track. So one of the things I wanted to mention on crops is Maryland has really invested a lot in cover cropping for the reasons I mentioned, particularly because of nutrient management benefits and the fact that cover crops help reduce nutrient runoff into our watersheds or tributaries and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. And farmers in Maryland have some of the highest rates of cover crop adoption anywhere in the country. And traditionally, we just pay per practice, right? We incentivize that behavior and we pay per practice. But the NRCS, and in partnership with the USDA, has tried to produce better tools to account for the carbon sequestration benefits of many of these practices. So cover cropping isn't just good for nutrient management, but it also can, in many cases, increase the amount of carbon being stored and maintained in the soil because of improved soil aggregate and soil health. So we want to think about how not only could we incentivize and pay people for implementing these existing best management practices, but if we can quantify the carbon benefits, provide an additional payment explicitly for those services. So Comet Farm is a specific tool that helps do that, where you as an individual farm or ranch could actually go in there and enter all your data, and it could tell you on average based on your land management history and current management practices how much carbon that you're storing in any given year, or where you have opportunity to increase that storage. And you might think that markets seem like they're a long ways away, like carbon market and its accessibility to the ag community might seem farther away than with forests, but the USDA just launched last month, a $1 billion grant investment opportunity for what they're calling climate smart commodities. This program is fascinating because what it's trying to do is trying to work with farmers and ranchers across the country to support the production and marketing of climate-smart commodities. So what is a climate-smart commodity? Well, it's thinking about how if you are going through the practice of managing your lands to increase its carbon sequestration benefit, and you can quantify, comes the science part, if you can quantify and report those benefits with trusted and reliable tools, then you could actually market your resulting products at a higher premium price because you're demonstrating that you're creating this product from climate smart techniques. And so this is an indirect way, like it's different than me renting the carbon outcome from you directly, even though I think that's still an opportunity, but it is an indirect way of paying you for the service that you're providing to society. And there's a lot of interest in trying to think about how to meet consumer demand, growing demand for sustainable products, but doing it in a way that we feel like we can, really feel good about the outcome because we have quantification and monitoring and verification that supports it. So it's a real economic opportunity, and I think it's really interesting how it highlights the need for cost-effective quantification and reporting. Which is also one reason why we've invested so much in remote sensing techniques, because that is actually a very cost-effective way of helping to measure and monitor change without the really otherwise labor-intensive practices of having to do it in the field. Again, having field-based research and assessment is vital because that helps us ground truth and make sure that we feel like what we're hearing from the estimates makes sense on the ground. But this is a way that we can scale it that we haven't been able to before. The last thing I wanted to just share a little bit about is on coastal tidal wetlands. And I know we're here in the middle of the country and we don't, we're not right by coastal tidal wetlands, but I, having moved to Maryland, wasn't around them much either, but learned to really love and appreciate them. And so I just wanted to take a minute to talk about that. So what's really cool about coastal carbon wetlands, of course, is that they're storing carbon really slowly, but they build up a huge reservoir or sink of carbon. And when they store and maintain that over time, like I mentioned, they store more carbon per acre than almost any other natural climate solution. So they're storing a ton of carbon. And what's interesting is that they're in a very dynamic tidal system anyway. Right? So they're used to a lot of variability, they're in a dynamic system, and the rate at which they accumulate is increasingly having to be competitive with some of the other climate change impacts we experience, like sea level rise. So saltwater intrusion, right? We live on the bay, it's a salty estuary. Saltwater intrusion on land, particularly farmland, which is across much of our eastern shore, is a really massive problem. So we're dealing with saltwater intrusion, and we're trying to think about how we can better manage this dynamic landscape and how we can help these systems keep up. So one really kind of sobering study was kind of looking at our current sort of baseline where our flux, if we have more gains than losses, and it's positive, that means it's a sink. It's storing more carbon every year than it's losing, right? That's a good thing in terms of are being climate friendly. So right now, all of our coastal tidal wetlands, most of them are keeping up their sink. But if sea levels continue to rise and we get something like a 4-foot increase in sea levels, we actually see that we might switch from being a net sink to a net source, meaning we're emitting more carbon every year from these systems than we're storing because they can't keep up, they're drowning. Basically, our wetlands are drowning from sea level rise. So this provides a really important opportunity to think about future land use planning. So when we're mapping this, we can identify those areas that are going to be most resilient. Hey, we think these marshes, they're going to keep up, and actually they provide a lot of resilience benefits because healthy wetlands actually protect all of the landowners inland from major storm events. They naturally serve as a buffer. They help actually reduce saltwater intrusion. So marshes can be our friends. Where are they going to be able to keep up? And then where, without additional help to migrate inland to facilitate movement, are they going to drown? And basically not only emit more carbon, but actually affect our ability to be resilient to these ongoing climate change effects. So this is very pragmatic or practical in the sense that we are working to identify landowners that are most at risk, thinking about what their options are and opportunities. If saltwater intrusions continuing to occur and they can't farm the land anymore, maybe we could pay them for the carbon benefits of actually allowing wetlands to migrate into their land. I'm not saying that that's a hard thing, but if you can't use the land for the purposes that you had been using it for generations, how can we still, acknowledge the benefits that your land could provide, even if they're different than maybe what you were providing before, and really compensating you for that? So this is a real challenging policy issue for not just Maryland, but a lot of the eastern coastal states that are facing a lot of challenges with sea level rise. So just to summarize, if you were taking away 3 points, I think I want you to maybe recognize that the conservation and restoration and improved management of our natural and working lands are actually tools for slowing climate change because as they're basically growing and thriving, they are taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in their living biomass and in the soils. That's amazing. That's a beautiful tool based on the way God designed them. And so by protecting them and restoring them and better managing them, better stewarding them, that's only going to help us in addressing some of our major societal challenges. But it's not just about slowing climate change. Investment in the land also yields a range of benefits for both resilience and adaptation. Just like investing in coastal wetlands helps protect us from major storm events and helps us improve our resilience, that's going to also do a lot of benefit for fisheries too. Wetlands provide a lot of opportunity for fisheries, and that's a huge part of our Maryland economy. So investment in land also helps us be stronger against the impacts that are already occurring. And then finally, innovative science actually makes this connection with economics much more tangible. And that if we can actually quantify these benefits with low uncertainties and high confidence, that actually makes payments for outcomes possible. And that market frontier is here. It's going to continue to grow. And so thinking about how to connect landowners with cost-effective strategies for doing that to access those markets is going to be critically important. And I think there's a lot more good questions we have to ask in that space of how we can, facilitate that kind of science that we feel good about. But I'm encouraged by what we've been able to do on the forest side of things, and increasingly feeling encouraged by the investment, like from the USDA, in helping think about how to do that in ag land too. So I'm going to pause there. I give you a lot of information. You're probably still digesting, but I would love any feedback or questions or comments from you, and maybe we could take some time to discuss it together. Oh, I do want to say one more thing. Sorry, I forgot I slide in. I talked about this earlier, and I wanted to highlight this again. My earlier talk was about the connections between faith and climate, and I talked a little bit about my personal story of how I came to care as a person of faith because of the way that climate change negatively impacts people and the most vulnerable first and foremost, how it negatively often impacts creation itself, and how in restoration of the land points to God's love and restoration for his world. And I just wanted to highlight that all the things that I'm talking about, even though most of that work is done in the context of so-called secular arenas, such as, in state and federal agencies and in academia and in government and policy, that there are so many great Christian and faith-based organizations that are on the front lines of trying to do this work. They're trying to showcase how restoration on the landscape with the view of conservation and human livelihood and climate change, how those things can be pulled together in real ways that try to assure mutual flourishing. And so I talked a little bit about some of these organizations that I've worked with personally, and even one of them that I championed to the students earlier today, which is Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which was founded almost 10 years ago to really assert that Christians, as part of their witness to the world, ought to be on the front lines of thinking through some of these really important societal challenges. So I just wanted to highlight them because I think it's really important for maybe you to know that Christians aren't absent in this space, even though sometimes it feels like, if you're like me, you're working in this space, sometimes it feels like you're alone. You're not, because you have every reason to care about it because of who God is and the fact that he loves his world, all of his world, including his creation. And loving him and loving your neighbor means really taking seriously some of the crises that they're facing, not just here and now, but also will continue in the future. So I did want to plug that and also welcome additional questions. Do we have any questions? And for the sake of online, I have
Thanks, Rachel. It was really nice. I got two questions for you, actually. The first one has to do with the species of trees that are being planted. Obviously, it's not all of these are equal. There's a paper that just came out in Science last week, as a matter of fact, from China, where they were comparing monocultures for forestry compared to natural diversity areas and that sort of thing. Are there, in the models that you're doing, do you take that sort of thing into consideration, whether or not you're looking at biodiversity as a component of all of this? That's my first question.
Yeah, great. So a couple different dimensions to that. So first of all, from the science technical point of view, what the model does is look at native plant functional types. So species levels here, plant functional types, it's like one order higher. So it's assuming that you're planting things that, like in Maryland, belong in Maryland. Or if you're looking at somewhere else in New England, you're planting things that should be planted in New England. And so you're right, if you're looking at a species-specific level, there's going to be some trade-offs. But in order to kind of represent the impact across space, it has to make some higher level assumptions because it doesn't know exactly which species is in every location. But it does make sure to emphasize what you're talking about is native tree plantings. Now, one other important thing that you mentioned is actually, it relates back to the very beginning around definitions. So globally, people say that the best natural climate solutions are also nature-based solutions, which means they're good for biodiversity and they're good for human livelihood. So if you were taking down a native diverse forest, cutting it down and then planting a monoculture, maybe that could provide some livelihood benefit if you were selling the timber, but that's not likely to be good for biodiversity. So thinking critically about the right tree in the right place and trying to make sure you're doing that with sensitivity to where they should belong, not planting them in the middle of a desert where they can't thrive anyway, and not planting monoculture plantations that are going to have adverse biodiversity impacts is really important. And that's something that gets criticized a lot, is thinking about these big scale afforestation restoration efforts in places where probably trees shouldn't be there to begin with. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about strategic reforestation, that we're thinking about native tree species and co-benefits for biodiversity at the same time.
Then the second question had to do with mitigating forest management, because one of the things that we see here, for example, in South Dakota, when you go to the western part of the state, or what you find in for example, the Boreal or even the many other places, is you start getting high densities of trees, and of course that leads to problems where those can lead to higher problems with forest fires, that sort of thing. So being able to do prescribed logging, how does that get taken into your model? Because obviously that's going to be a carbon plus.
Yeah.
And that's not something that's necessarily an immediate problem, but how do you look at that for the long term, which is what your goals are, is to have a long term. So do you correct for these pluses that are put in that are not currently there to manage the forests and keep them where they're?
Yeah, so great question about forest management. I think just like I showed in sort of how the USDA describes a forest carbon cycle, you're going to have some level of loss and removal that's happening, right? You're going to have some trees that are, if it's healthy and functioning, even some senses have fire that move across the landscape and help maintain the system. So not to say that there shouldn't be losses, that's just part of maintaining the balance. When we have like a history of forest management that is, not burning, not logging, and you have really high vegetation or high density forests, they're actually not as healthy as they could be. So a lot of discussion around foresters is how you would go in and do selective thinning or management to actually reduce the fire risk. Maybe take the trees that you're taking out and put them in long-lived wood products like antique furniture, which the carbon remains stored for a long time. It's not immediately released. And if you have new trees that are young and growing, now they're sequestering carbon again at a much higher rate. They're younger, so they're still having a pretty high carbon benefit. So thinking about the life cycle of those trees and really thinking about forest management, I think, and healthy forests is critical. And I actually think a lot of people who maybe are more, maybe you would call them more environmentalists, like don't take down any trees, probably don't often have a healthy view of forest management, and the fact that healthy forest management does actually mean removal of some biomass at time. So the model that I showed you, the next step is to include more sensitivity around forest management. So it's showing you changes of losses and regrowth. So it's really getting at existing trees continuing to grow and new area of reforestation that are occurring. But that forest management term is something there's been a lot of invested interest in. And actually it's in that USDA $1 billion grant opportunity that I talked about, is how we can better quantify the impacts of forest management and really showcase some of those techniques that really are looking at a life cycle perspective and are more climate forward. And we had a research grant with Pennsylvania, who you know anything about Pennsylvania, it's full of trees and state forest land, and they're really interested in asking these questions and trying to get an improved quantification. So we have some numbers that we hope in our next iteration to include in the model. But I just want to emphasize the point that, yeah, healthy forests and healthy management doesn't mean no trees are removed. That actually healthy forests, such as mitigating wildlife risk, might mean that you're thinking about that as well.
Why, you talk about your tidal wetlands. Obviously, we don't have tidal wetlands here, so why are like river wetlands, just wetlands, not as good, and can we utilize them here?
Yeah, so another fun term is that people often call tidal coastal wetlands blue carbon, or seagrasses blue carbon, marine carbon, and they often call freshwater wetlands teal carbon. So if you ever hear that term, that's what they're meaning. What's interesting about freshwater wetlands is that if you're looking, they do also store a lot of carbon. They have deep soil reservoirs. They store a lot of carbon. But again, when we think about the annual amount of carbon that they're sequestering in any given year, they still do some, but it's usually less than the amount of methane that they release. So greenhouse gases can have warming impacts, right? If you have too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it's like putting an extra blanket around the Earth. So carbon dioxide is, potent, but methane is way more potent. So if you're looking at just a single freshwater wetland and you're looking at the flux from just a climate point of view, we don't want to lose them, because again, protecting them means we want to protect the carbon that they store, but restoring them doesn't necessarily have a net positive or immediate benefit to the climate, because they're really releasing more greenhouse gases than they're sequestering in a given year. So there are a lot of reasons why we would want to protect freshwater wetlands, because they provide a lot of other ecosystem services to us, including filtering out pollutants, et cetera. So there's a lot of good reasons to protect them, and protecting them for the carbon they're already storing is good. But trying to scale their restoration for immediate short-term benefits for climate is not as strategic as doing something like a coastal wetland, which would tend to have very low methane release depending on salinity and would have more annual benefit.
The general tone of the presentation seemed to be that there's a fairly clear path of some sort with things to still be explored. I wonder if you'd want to comment on where some of the tripwires are. What are the hot buttons that are going to get in the way of thinking about moving in the direction you're talking?
Well, since you're an economist, as I learned earlier, I think the whole way that we're trying to evaluate uncertainty and the price of uncertainty. So there's a lot of programs that are already being set up to pay people for carbon. It's a voluntary landscape, right? There's no regulatory market for it. So there's a lot of voluntary markets. And they really try to reduce the amount of scientific uncertainty related to the estimation of the carbon benefit. But anytime you're putting a dollar value to it, you have to accept sort of some uncertainty range that comes with it, right? And I think societally, I think the science has driven down the uncertainty in many ways, but it's not going to completely eliminate it, especially if we're trying to do it at scale. So I'm looking for financial investment and economic opportunities that is willing to accept some level of risk, but we don't want to continue emitting a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and then saying that we're making up for it by protecting and restoring all of these carbon sinks, but really maybe the benefit isn't additional or it's not as good as we thought. We're not going to come out ahead. So we want to make sure that we're investing in real opportunities where we can reduce uncertainty and reduce the risk, and then really feel increasingly confident, even if we don't, perfectly eliminate uncertainty, feel confident that really we're paying for real outcomes and that those benefits are really going to help us from a climate point of view. And I was talking to the students earlier about the concept of a carbon offset. I don't know if anyone's heard of that term, but it's basically a trade-off where you have a company like Delta. I was explaining, I flew on Delta, and Delta has on their napkin that they're carbon neutral, and they had a little link, so I went to the link and I wanted to see what they thought, what they meant by being carbon neutral. And they basically are saying for all of the emissions, that they're emitting from the use of their combustion of their fuel, that they're purchasing that same amount of carbon other places, so that it's a neutral benefit, right? But I would want to know, how confident are you in those offsets? Do you know that the carbon is being sequestered is real? Otherwise, it's kind of greenwashing, right? It's like, look, we're climate friendly. You can feel good flying with us, but really from a climate point of view, it's really not additional or beneficial. So that is a hot topic. Carbon offsets is a hot topic because, again, I think nature's great. You heard me championing it. I think it can be a tool, but you got to make sure that you have the scientific support to make sure that those benefits are real, so that you don't just use it as an excuse not to drive down emissions in other places.
Okay, so I think what you have been touching on has been great. I just have a question regarding the farming topic.
Yeah.
How many farmers would you say have been on board with this, and what are the difficulties of trying to explain this to many farmers who are generational, because many of them are old school?
Well, all I can do is give you some examples of what I've been learning from farmers in Maryland. So we work with Maryland Department of Ag. So take that with a grain of salt, but I'll tell you what I've been learning from them is I think that they're on the front, they've long been on the front lines of stewardship of the land, right? I told you they have high levels of cover crop adoption, not only because it's helping improve yields and protecting soil stability, and because they're committed to caring about the bay, the health of the bay. It's also a cultural thing, right? To be a Marylander is to be proud of the bay, and you want a healthy bay, and if you can contribute to it in some way, you want to. So now the state has also invested in that by providing financial incentives to make sure that those practices are viable, right? But that linkage between stewardship and connection with the land and the fact that you're also contributing to that water quality goal of the state, farmers, that they're teaching, they're showing us, they're leading the way on that. So what I've learned most recently is there was a climate vulnerability assessment in the state, and they were listening to farmers and what they were already experiencing about changes to climate, right? Maybe it was more extreme weather, maybe it was changes to precipitation patterns. That's livelihood, right? They're sensitive to that already. So what they're saying is, how are we going to adapt and stay resilient to these changes that are occurring? So the resilience and adaptation lens, they're asking these questions, and they're saying, help us figure out how to transition and incentivize the transition. Thinking about their land as also a tool for additional carbon sequestration. I think the movement from thinking about implementing best management practices and paying per practice to thinking about paying for outcomes, like paying you for the carbon you're storing, that is a paradigm shift. But I think that the fact is farmers are already in the front lines of doing that. They already are interested in the practices that do have carbon sequestration benefits. So if you reduce the barriers, the science and quantification and economic barriers to actually quantifying those outcomes and helping crosswalk and show how there's an economic incentive for doing that, in addition to all the other incentives that it already has, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And the fact that some of those practices already also help with adaptation and resilience. So my experience learning from them is that, yeah, I think thinking about paying for carbon outcomes is a little bit on the edge and frontier, because that's not traditionally how we've thought about incentivizing practices. But the orientation towards stewarding the land and thinking about how to do that in a way that increases livelihood benefits is not a stretch. It might be different in other places, but I've noticed that there's a lot of interest in that where I live.
I have kind of an off-the-wall question, because I don't know a whole lot about forests in Maryland, because I grew up on the West Coast, but I'm pretty sure that it's mostly deciduous trees. I'm curious as to how do evergreens compare to deciduous trees as far as storing carbon?
That's a good question. In terms of its plant functional type, maybe it might be species dependent, but I know there's a lot of work being done to map the benefits of trees in the Pacific Northwest. They're very forward. I'm thinking also about the carbon benefits of those trees, and like some of the iconic forests, like not just the redwoods, but some of those major tropical, subtropical forests in, is that the right? I'm trying to think of the ecosystem type, but like Olympia National Park, you know, along the coastline. Yeah, thank you. Temperate rainforest. They store a whole lot of carbon, and those aren't all coniferous trees, but I think they do pretty well. I couldn't tell you right now off the top of my head exactly tree for tree which one does better, but I know that they've done a lot of work to map that amount of carbon. I think if you think about a boreal context, that's also really interesting.
I was thinking more of in Maryland itself. Like, do they have any coastal pine trees?
Yeah. I think it's a deciduous coniferous mix. It's not the same as in the Pacific Northwest, but yeah, we do have some Christmas tree farms and some other kind of forest management techniques. We don't have a really large forest timber industry. Actually, the forest, part of my point earlier about maybe we need a healthier view of forest management, part of our forest industry has declined a lot because we're trying to protect existing cover but don't have a great sense of where opportunities are for forest products. So there's a lot of interest in revitalizing it.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you, Rachel. It was a great lecture. Really appreciate it. And I'm just curious, if we did have a nationwide carbon tax, how would that impact the program that you described?
Well, you're seeding a question we were talking about earlier. So carbon taxes can be applied in a lot of different ways, and people think about how carbon taxes maybe are being applied to industries that are primary sources. So there's different models, like a cap and trade model or a carbon tax model, and the idea is that you want to incentivize a reduction of emissions at the source, from the smokestack or out the tailpipe, and you want to find a way to do that that doesn't unfairly redistribute that extra cost to consumers, and especially not redistribute it in a way that further marginalizes maybe poor communities. But that kind of tax to attack the source of emissions is interesting because it could be juxtaposed against some kind of payment of carbon sequestration outcomes to a landowner. So it'd be interesting if you had a tax on a major source. We have a cap in the East Coast. We have a cap and trade model, which is not a tax, but we regulate. 11 states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative regulate emissions from coal-fired power plants. We cap in emissions across the whole region, and we say collectively we aren't going to emit more than this. Then every single power plant is permitted, and then basically what they do is they have to, they have some incentive to be efficient, because if they can go below the amount that they're permitted, they could sell those remaining permits to some other power plant that's not doing so well, right? So there's an economic incentive to be below the limit while everyone stays below the big cap. And then all of those proceeds can be reinvested into more climate-friendly practices. And one of the opportunities in Maryland is to take the proceeds from our power plants doing better at reducing emissions and reinvesting it to pay people for the carbon that they're storing on their landscape, so that it's a way of reducing it at its source and then additionally capturing more carbon on the landscape. So I don't, I don't ever see a carbon tax being applied to like, at a landowner scale. It's really targeting major industries, but we have to find a way to make sure that it's not unfairly distributed to, individuals. Maybe it applies an appropriate change in behavior by incentivizing lower emissions products or electricity sources. But I think it could be separately, separate from thinking about some kind of payment for services where we don't just penalize you for the cost of carbon, but we pay you for the benefits of carbon as well.
If you want to incentivize climate-smart commodities, what are the climate-smart commodities?
Yeah, so it's a good question because I want to see what happens in these grant proposals. I think many things could be climate-smart commodities. I think it's going to boil down to how you, in the production of whatever that commodity is, whether it's from it's timber or corn or soybeans or whatever it is, that the practice of producing it is trying to reduce additional emissions or showing how you can sequester additional carbon. And so it could be things like crop rotation or cover cropping or some of these identified practices where they have enough field studies to demonstrate that there is some additional benefit to doing that from a carbon point of view. And if you as a consumer, if I'm a consumer and I'm looking and I could buy also, corn's in everything. I don't know what a great example would be, but if you had a product and I knew it came from XYZ farm and it had some kind of, logo or stamp or it was said, hey, this is produced as a climate smart commodity, I might be willing to pay more because I'm thinking about the upstream, impacts of those improved management practices. I think this is where the USDA is going, is it's thinking if you're the farmer or you're the rancher, if you can demonstrate that the method of production is more climate smart, meaning you're sequestering more carbon than you might be releasing, and it's also good for you because of all the soil health benefits, et cetera, then you might get a premium. So I think the commodity could be a lot of different things. I think it's really going to boil down to how you quantify the process or the approach and how that approach yields additional carbon benefits, which really relies on what kind of science tools are out there to do that, right? The burden shouldn't be on you as the landowner or the farmer to do that. You're going to need some support from like soil and water conservation districts or like a Department of Ag or existing tools to really make that make sense.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight and joining in on this conversation and thinking about what other questions might come and how we might answer them as they come. Please help me in thanking Dr. Lamb for joining us today.